I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Brian Perkins, the director of the Summer Principals Academy at Columbia University Teachers College. Dr. Brian Perkins is the director of the Summer Principals Academy, and his research is focused on urban school climate and leadership development. Dr. Perkins' presentation will highlight the skills and dispositions necessary to serve as an educational leader in today's world. And his talk is titled Preparing Leaders for Crisis and Beyond, Educational Leadership for Community Development and Sustainability. Brian, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you very well.
Okay, excellent. So hello to my colleagues around the globe. Welcome to my home office and now my classroom during these times. I have transformed my classroom into more of a space, I guess you could say, conducive to the way I provide lectures in person. And so I'm really delighted to be a part of this. Throughout the day, I've heard and I've been able to come in and out. And so I want to thank all of you who've been here. And now for some places it might be fairly late in the evening. And hopefully I can keep you awake for another half hour or so before we transition out. And so thank you, Liat, who invited me to be a part of this, as I've worked with the Moffitt Institute some years ago. And so I'm glad to be remembered by the Institute and delighted to be here. So as you can see, the title is talking about kind of our current crisis and beyond. And I know throughout the day today, everyone has been talking about teacher education for the most part. And either our experiences during COVID, our experiences leading up, where we are now, and I will, if we have time at the end, give you an update about some of the things that are happening here right now with projections for our next school year, which is supposed to start in some states, will start in early August, but then other states as late as September. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But what I want to talk about and focus on, because I'm the director of a master's degree program that leads to leadership preparation at the school building level. At the time that I was working with Moffitt Institute before, I was the director of our doctoral program that was aimed to prepare district level leaders, people who were over multiple schools. This opportunity came up in this directorship and I jumped at it because I thought about the kind of what was the key, what I see as one of the key leverage points for change in education is at the school building leader level. And so while we've been talking a lot about teacher education, I'm going to talk to you about the what needs to be done, not so much the how. We are right now in the middle of our program. We have two site locations, one that's based in New Orleans, in the South, the southern region of the United States, that's going on right now. And next week starts the 5-week program in New York City, which is also being done online. But what I want to talk to you first and foremost about is the what of leadership, and again, not the how. We are fully engaged in online learning, and typically this program would be experiential. And when I get to our guiding framework, I want to tell you a little bit of how we're accomplishing some of this, a little bit of the how. But what I think is critically important right now for us to think about beyond what we're doing for teachers is also thinking about how are we preparing leaders for this time. And I've worked with a lot of leaders right now, both at the very, as you say, at the tip top of the organizational pyramid, and I've seen the kinds of things that they're struggling with to be effective in leadership roles and keep teachers and students on the path of development as well. And so if you'll notice what I'm going to do here, let me just make sure I have my screen here, is that I want to start with this because this is really what frames what I'm going to talk about, is that over time, expectations have changed for schools and educational leaders. I mean, we've talked today at length about the expectations for teachers, but schools as a whole, the expectations have changed. And then so that also means not only teachers, but also leaders. So if you will indulge me just for about 3 or 4 minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about how I see, if I may, take you across the history, if you will, of where we were, and at least in the United States, and then where we've ended up right now. And so just a few minutes to, if you would, engage me in a brief history lesson, kind of as I see it. And I think you'll agree that probably some 60, 75 years ago, pretty straightforward mandate for schools. And it was to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, a fairly basic understanding of what schools do. And so even as far back as then, in a lot of developed areas, as 75 years or so ago, or even more, that reading, writing, arithmetic, what we used to refer to in the States as the 3 R's. We would shorten it, say reading, writing, and arithmetic. I know my colleagues in the UK probably cringe at me saying that, but reading, writing, and arithmetic were the 3 primary things that happened in schools. And probably a fair assessment of whether or not a school was a good school or not, based on what was expected, was that we had our kids take tests, and if they did well, one could reasonably conclude that the school was a good school if the children did well. It's fairly reasonable. But it was all because framed around the expectations were that schools were responsible for reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now, I'm going to be speaking from a United States context, but I know that it parallels some other places around the globe when I say, then, somewhere in the 1970s, some things changed. And for the most part, really global economies shifted and families shifted in terms of composition. And certainly in the United States, there were families that were where both parents were out of the home working, and different things happened, and other aspects of what needed to happen changed, where we started to insert things like health services and social services and even special education, where I'm talking about the education of individuals with disabilities, became more present in our schools in the 1970s. But one thing didn't change. We still said a school was a good school, whether or not they did good or did well on these standardized tests. But as you can see, things shifted. Well, they got a little more complicated, and certainly they got more complicated for us circa early 1990s or so, I should say early 1980s. And some of you are very well aware, and I have somewhere on my bookshelf here, a small book that was written from an education commission in the States, and it was called A Nation at Risk. And some of you may be familiar with this small report that was written that essentially said the United States risks its national security, and its global positioning economically if the education system isn't addressed. And so then we came into this idea that we needed to have full service schools. And you'll see there were a number of other expectations that were placed on schools and thereby placed on leaders. But as you can see, things like academic supplies, even after school care programs and uniforms and health services and on, these things became a part of what was expected from schools. But we still said schools are good doing this if they do well on standardized tests. And then, as if it couldn't be even more complicated, right? So now things got more complicated for us in the States, where we implemented a new law that was referred to as No Child Left Behind. I'm sure some of you in education have been very familiar with this. So in addition to all the things that you saw on the previous slide that were being done, that there were relationships that were expected between local businesses and the community and government agencies, and that this all had to be managed at the school level. And so, as you can see, you remember that very first slide that was very, very simple triangle. Now we have something that looks very different, but we still measured schools about whether they did well or they're good schools or not based on standardized tests. So I'm gonna stick a pin right here for a minute and say, I'm not an opponent of standardized tests. I think they tell us some things if they're well constructed, but they don't capture all the things that are expected of schools today. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is that in addition to what you see here, this picture, what happens is, and I don't know if it shows up on your screen, is that what happens is this whole thing gets colored by our social dynamic that happens in school. And you can't ignore that. And so all these things are important, and standardized tests are important, but all of these things take place in what I've tried to represent by coloring it all in is a social dynamic. And it covers everything that left unattended, that education is not maximized. Okay, so that's what I wanted to, kind of frame and talk about first. And so what I'm talking about, what we hold in our program is to help our mindsets shift in leadership preparation programs from being transactional in nature to transformational in nature. And so what do I mean by that? Transactional leadership is simply the things that have to be done, the filling out of forms, the making sure attendance is taken, and the ordinary budgets have been addressed. All of these are very important tasks, but that's not all that needs to be done. But in moving from transactional to transformational, there are situations where you have to focus on the things that are kind of checklists that have to be done. But transformational leadership relies heavily on relationship building and having influence in your organizations. And so while a balanced approach is what is necessary in various situations, there are times when you have to have transactional skills that I'm going to talk about in a moment, and transformational skills. That is to move the organization and to serve as a kind of visionary for the organization to say where we're going and how we're going to get there. That is a very different kind of training that has to occur, because you're not simply pouring in a skill set of how do you complete forms. Now we're talking about how do you present as a leader, not a manager? How do you present as someone who is capable of motivating people, of providing encouragement, and attending to various social and emotional needs as well? And so you see, one of the hooks here is that while we're talking about and have been talking throughout the day, a common theme that kept coming up that I was hearing from our presenters was about social and emotional needs and talking about teachers and then students. But what I'm maintaining here is that if leaders aren't on board and don't have the skill sets also to help schools be places where social and emotional learning is respected and important, we don't accomplish those things. And so effective leaders are among the top 5 factors in quality schools and student performance. So that's where we are. So we hold a very well-known kind of personal philosophical concept for our leaders in our program. And so at the base of this is know thyself. So it's an age-old mantra that has been attributed to probably to a dozen or more philosophers over time. Know thyself. And so we do that, and we accomplish that in very explicit and deliberate ways. Is that we're saying that knowledge of self provides you the base for being able to move and lead others. You can't lead anyone is our real, if I could say, the groundwork for how we prepare our leaders is that you can't lead others until you know who you are, what it is that motivates you before you can motivate others, how to do that. So you have to know who you are. So this is our guiding framework in the Summer Principals Academy. Just recently, I did some work and some research on what our students were saying really stuck with them over the years with our program, and made some additions to this. At one point, you'll see to the left and the right this model: leadership competencies, managerial competencies, PK-12, pedagogical instructional philosophy, and adult professional development. Those 4 tenets were what the model used to look like. I have recently added to this model self-awareness and community engagement. So because in terms of the amount of time we have today, I'm going to stick with talking about the self-awareness component, because I think that more so, kind of than any of the other pieces you see here, and I think is that it's going to start the real key to where our schools go will be largely dependent on leadership ability to get us through making the transitions from being online back on the ground. And that's going to start with some really deep self-awareness. Now, so as I promised, and I just want to take a look at my time here.
Yeah, you have about a little less than 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So what I want to do is I just want to say, if you look at this, you'll notice that when I talked about transactional and transformational, you'll see managerial competencies is there. That's what we're talking about in the transactional component. And then transformational, we're talking about leadership competencies. But as I said, self-awareness is what I'm going to deal with very briefly in what we're talking about here. So when I said deliberately, there's some things that we do that we're in aligned with know thyself. There's some things that we do in our program that help provide our leaders, our individuals who are aspiring leaders to know and have knowledge of self. And so you'll see here, the first one you'll see here is mindfulness training. And so essentially, what is mindfulness training? Mindfulness training in our program involves every single day of the 5, we have 2 5-week sessions over 2 summers. Mindfulness training, they sit in the beginning of the day for an hour with trained mindfulness facilitators and teachers to learn how to center themselves. They learn meditation practices. They learn how to calm themselves in stressful situations. And so that helps them. What we did research on our program, and in the first 5 years of the program, we looked and we asked individuals, once they became leaders, to tell us what skills were most often used that they acquired when they were in our program. And so we taught them aspects about budgeting and finance, about adult professional development, curriculum, and the list goes on and on, about the law. And the list goes on and on, the ordinary components in leadership development that we typically teach. But what we found was most of our students said that what they employed most frequently in their roles as teachers, as leaders, was the mindfulness component to their work. And so it really for us drove the point home that we needed to increase the mindfulness practices and be more deliberate about its role in our program. Then we did also and do another component that's a 360 feedback instrument called Leadership Practices Inventory. And that's where they look at gaps between their perceptions and other perceptions. We do another instrument that's called Strengths Finder. And it's where they identify and learn about what their strengths are and where, based on years and years of research from the Gallup organization about when you're operating in your strength zone, how much more effective your organization is. We also do a survey, an inventory to let them understand, and this is actually called the intercultural conflict style inventory. We do an inventory to let individuals know what are their preferences when they are dealing with conflict, and we teach them about the different ways in cultural contexts in which conflict can be addressed. And last but not least is one that is very important to us, that is their leadership assessment inventory called the LAI, and it's about leadership behavior preferences. Are they more likely to take a transactional approach to something or a transformational approach to it? But in summary, what I want to say is, while we've been talking about what teachers have to do, and they are extraordinarily important to be thinking about what's going to happen in classrooms, but overall the directions of schools and what will happen after COVID, we have to have leaders that are prepared for this work. The new work ahead isn't a series of transactions that are going to happen. They're going to have to move people and motivate people in ways that they've not done before. So I'll stop there, see if you have any questions, and I'll just leave my contact information there.
Thank you, Brian. And I will now give Jay.
Yes, it's now question time. At the moment, I think, Brian, because you're at the very end of the day, I think people have sort of asked out of questions. I don't know if there's someone who really wants to ask something at the moment.
No, I understand.
But if I may, I think that I would like to say something about the entire day in general. One of the things which I particularly liked about this day, and I only realized this a little bit toward the end, was that nobody used the word digital natives when we were talking about students. And I'm so happy that I've been reading so much about what's happening with in COVID today, how it's affecting the education, and everybody has to say something about those digital natives, even though years ago this has been found to be a myth. And here a full day went by when we didn't have to deal with that. I think that's a wonderful sign for the strength of the group of people who were here today. Ruth Barsanai asks, are you using methods in movement and arts in your leadership work?
And I was just responding, yes, we do. We dedicate a portion of the program to arts. In fact, we have a through line where there are seminars every single week that our students participate in. It's called Arts and Leadership. Let me give you one quick example. We have where instead of having our students do hear a lecture on the importance of communications in leadership, we invite spoken word artists to come in and do presentations that have elements very similar to what a lecture might be, like saying things like your intent, knowing your audience, but done to have them have an appreciation and understanding of things like spoken word. We also have where we invite people who are playwrights and talk about the different components of a successful play and orchestrating that. And so but arts is a very big part of it.
Okay, there are a couple of more questions in here. I'll go to the second one first, and then how do you think transnational relations can be established in the context of the pandemic, which of course is what we were dealing with today. And at the same time, I'll just refer to Suzanne's question here about, are you using a Freirean perspective in part of what you do here?
Well, I would say yes. Our students definitely we use at the base Paulo Freire, his work, and it is a part of what our students get as we think about elements like diversity, equity, and social justice is another through line in our program. And so yes, beyond self-awareness is this idea of having a bigger purpose in mind is also a part of that. And the other question there about transactional relations, I think it's complicated in the sense that, and as I understand what's being asked here about transactional relations, is that I think where we are is that principals, if we stay in an online environment, if we stay in that, it's going to be even more of a challenge, but have to be intentional the way people go about engaging in relationships. And so I just think it will require a different skill set. So I guess it's not going to be if we do it. I think we must figure it out in order to be successful. My mentor at Yale Medical School, Dr. James Comer, said, and he's a world-renowned child psychiatrist. He used to say this. He'd say 3 things matter in schools, only 3 things. And while everyone would listen with bated breath to hear these 3 things, he'd say relationships, relationships, relationships. Those are the things that matter in schools, because without establishing solid relationships, you don't accomplish much. So that for me was very, very important.
Relationships, nobody's going to argue with that, except that we are going to say that one of the things that matters with us is keeping in time. So thank you very, very much, Brian and Liat.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian.